In the heart of 12th century England, power wasn't just worn, it was performed. Kings were gods among men, their words sharper than any sword, their anger deadlier than any disease. But beneath the crown of King Henry II, a storm brewed, one that would one day shake the walls of Christendom itself. Thomas Becket's story did not begin in power. It began in the narrow, bustling streets of London, where merchants called out over the chatter of horse hooves and the clang of iron. Born to Norman parents of modest means, Thomas was clever, too clever for his station. His eyes missed nothing. His tongue was quick, his wit sharper than the dagger at his belt. The boy who once ran errands for the city's traders would soon walk among kings. He rose fast, like a man racing up a burning ladder. He studied law, served powerful clerics, and caught the attention of one of the most ambitious monarchs England had ever seen, Henry Plantagenet, King Henry II. Henry, fierce and brilliant, saw in Thomas not just a servant, but a mirror, someone who understood power, strategy, and ambition. They became inseparable, the king and his chancellor, two men of fire and intellect. Henry found in Thomas a friend who could match his wit, who could argue without fear. Together, they reformed the kingdom's finances, strengthened royal authority, and dreamed a new England where law stood above chaos. Henry laughed often in those days. The court whispered that the king loved Thomas as a brother. But friendship, when mixed with power, is a dangerous wine. Henry's England was a land of tension between crown and church. The Church of Rome wielded immense power. Bishops and abbots answered not to the king, but to the pope. Priests were tried not in royal courts, but in ecclesiastical ones, beyond Henry's reach. To a king who believed in total authority, this was a thorn that drew blood daily. And Henry wanted control. He wanted England whole and undivided. So he came up with a plan that would haunt history forever. He would make his dearest friend, Thomas Becket, the Archbishop of Canterbury, the highest religious office in England. Who better to control the church than the man he trusted most? At first, Thomas refused. "My liege," he warned, "if I become archbishop, our friendship will be tested. I cannot serve both God and the crown." But Henry laughed. "Thomas, you serve me first. God will understand." And so, in 1162, Thomas Becket, once a courtier and soldier of politics, was ordained archbishop. The bells of Canterbury rang. England rejoiced. The king had placed his friend upon the throne of holiness itself. But power changes men, and holy power changes them most of all. Almost overnight, Becket transformed. Gone was the lavish chancellor, who wore fine furs and hunted beside the king. The new archbishop wore sackcloth beneath his robes, ate no meat, and spent nights in prayer. He gave up luxury for austerity. The laughter between the two men turned into silence. Henry expected loyalty. Thomas gave him conscience. When royal courts demanded control over criminous clerks, priests who committed crimes, Becket refused to surrender them. "No man of God," he declared, "shall be judged by a secular hand." It was the beginning of the end. At Clarendon, in 1164, the two former friends faced each other for the first time as enemies. The king demanded that Thomas sign the Constitutions of Clarendon, a document asserting the crown's supremacy over the church. Henry's court was full of bishops and barons watching, waiting to see if the archbishop would bend. Thomas hesitated, his lips trembling. He had loved this man, this king. He owed him everything. But then he said softly, "By God's honor, I will not." The room froze. Henry's face turned red. The friendship that had built a kingdom shattered like glass. From that day forward, Thomas Becket became an enemy of the crown. He fled England under threat of arrest, taking refuge in France. The Pope himself received him, and Europe watched in fascination as England's king and archbishop tore Christendom apart with their feud. For 6 long years, Becket lived in exile. He wrote letters to the Pope, to bishops, to the king, pleading, warning, and defying. Henry sent envoys to threaten him, spies to watch him, and even assassins to silence him. But Becket survived, nourished by his faith and his growing conviction that he was standing for something greater than his own life. Then, in 1170, the tide turned. Tired of conflict and political pressure from Rome, Henry sought reconciliation. He invited Becket back to England. The Archbishop returned triumphantly, greeted by cheering crowds. He had become more than a priest. He was a symbol of defiance, a hero of the church. But Henry's forgiveness was not complete, and Becket's pride had grown too large to bow. The seeds of tragedy had already been sown. When Thomas Becket stepped onto English soil in December 1170, the winter wind bit hard, but the cheers of the people were warm enough to drown it out. Bells rang across the countryside. Townsfolk knelt as he passed. To the faithful, it was not merely the return of man, but of a martyr in waiting. A shepherd come home to protect his flock from the claws of a hungry crown. But in the dark corners of castles, not everyone celebrated. To Henry's barons and bishops, Becket was trouble, pure and holy trouble. The king himself was hundreds of miles away in Normandy when news reached him of Becket's triumphant return. He was surrounded by his knights, and though the fire in the great hall blazed hot, something colder began to stir inside him. "Becket rides through my kingdom as if he were the king himself," one of his courtiers murmured. Henry clenched his fist. His friend, his enemy, his creation. For a brief moment, Henry had believed peace was possible. He had allowed Becket to return, hoping their old friendship might heal the rift between crown and church. But Becket had changed. He was no longer the loyal chancellor who laughed beside him. He was the archbishop, the man of God, unyielding, proud, and utterly beyond the king's control. And Becket wasted no time reminding everyone of it. Within days of returning, he excommunicated several bishops loyal to Henry, men who had supported the king during his exile. It was an open slap in the face, and word of it raced across England like wildfire. In London taverns and abbey halls alike, people whispered, "The archbishop has defied the crown again." When news reached Henry, his fury was volcanic. Those who knew him well said his face turned the color of wine, his voice breaking through the halls of his castle like thunder. "What insolence!" he roared. "The man I raised from nothing. This priest dares to challenge me before God and man?" He stormed through the corridors, ripping the fur from his cloak, his temper a living beast. The court fell silent as he shouted the words that history would never forget. "Will no one rid me of this turbulent priest?" They were words of rage, not command. But to four knights who stood nearby, men desperate for royal favor, they sounded like an order written in blood. Their names were Reginald Fitzurse, Hugh de Morville, William de Tracy, and Richard le Breton, noblemen of proud lineage, warriors loyal to the king. They exchanged glances, their faces hard as iron. To them, the king's outburst was clear. If Becket's rebellion ended, so would England's torment. And so they made a silent vow. If their king could not act, they would. While Henry fumed in Normandy, Becket went about his duties at Canterbury. He seemed calm, almost serene. But beneath his holy composure, there was unease. He knew the king's wrath. He had seen it burn through courts, lands, and men. Still, he stood firm. "I have no enemies," he told his monks, "save those who seek to destroy the church. If I must die, I die for Christ." It was a cold December afternoon when the four knights landed on English shores. The sea hissed behind them like a warning. They rowed hard for Canterbury, cloaked against the wind, their armor glinting like storm clouds in motion. As they approached the great cathedral, they passed pilgrims kneeling in prayer. One muttered a blessing. Another crossed himself, whispering that he had seen death in their eyes. The knights entered Canterbury on December 29th, 1170. They found Becket in his palace, seated by the fire, dictating letters. He looked up as they burst through the doors, their faces tight with purpose. "My lords," Becket greeted, voice calm. "What brings you here armed to the teeth?" Fitzurse stepped forward. "We come from the king," he said, slamming his gauntlet on the table. "You have betrayed him, Archbishop. You have defied his law. We demand that you lift your excommunications and submit to royal authority." Becket's eyes narrowed. "You speak of law," he said softly, "but not of justice. The king's power ends where God's house begins." His refusal only fueled their rage. De Morville leaned close, snarling, "You have made yourself greater than the king. You forget who made you what you are." "I remember well," Becket replied, and I will answer to God for both our souls." The knights' patience snapped. They left the palace, slamming the doors behind them, vowing to return with force. As they stalked through the cold streets, one shouted to the townsfolk, "Stand aside, traitors' friends! The king's men will not be defied." Night fell heavy over Canterbury. Inside the cathedral, monks lit candles and began evening prayers. Becket, knowing what would come, entered the holy space barefoot, wrapped in his robes. The flickering flames cast long shadows across the stone pillars. He stood before the altar whispering, "Into thy hands, O Lord, I commend my spirit." Outside, the knights armed themselves. They had shed hesitation. Now there was only grim resolve. Fitzurse's voice was steady as he spoke. "By this blade, the king shall have peace." They pushed through the cathedral doors. The crash of iron against what echoed like thunder through the sanctuary. Monks screamed, scattering like frightened birds. The knights strode in, their swords drawn, armor clanking with each step. Becket turned to face them. He did not run. He did not beg. He stood firm, tall and silent, his figure framed by the light of the altar. "Where is Thomas Becket, traitor to the king and realm?" Fitzurse shouted. "I am here," Becket answered. "No traitor, but a priest of God. What do you seek?" "Your submission," cried Tracy. Becket's voice rang clear through the cathedral. "I submit to no judgment of men. I am ready to die for my Lord." The air was thick with fear. One monk tried to pull Becket away, but he refused to move. "Leave me," he said quietly. "I will not flee from death." The knights advanced, swords gleaming under candlelight. Fitzurse struck first, aiming at Becket's head. The blow tore through his mitre and drew blood, the crimson running down his face like holy wine. Another sword followed, then another. The monks cried out, some rushing forward, others collapsing in prayer. As the final blow fell, Becket's voice rose above the chaos, his last words echoing through the cathedral. "For the name of Jesus and protection of the church, I am ready to die." His body crumpled at the foot of the altar. The knights stepped back, breathing hard, the reality of what they had done sinking in. Blood pooled across the stone floor, mingling with candle wax and tears. The cathedral, once a house of prayer, now reeked of death. Outside, the wind howled through the streets of Canterbury as if the heavens themselves were mourning. The knights fled into the night, their swords still stained, their names forever marked by the curse of a king's wrath. But the story did not end with Becket's death. It had only begun to rise, like a storm over Europe, for in killing the Archbishop, those knights had done more than murder a man. The cathedral was silent now. Only the faint crackle of dying candles broke the stillness. Thomas Becket lay motionless, his body sprawled before the altar, his skull split, his blood seeping into the cold stone floor of Canterbury Cathedral. The knights had fled into the black night, their armor clanking like the echoes of guilt itself. Outside, the wind carried the scent of rain and blood through the streets. The monks, trembling, dared to approach only after the killers had vanished. When they lifted their fallen archbishop, a murmur passed between them, half sob, half prayer. One whispered, "We have seen the death of a saint." They washed his wounds, wept over him, and wrapped his body in the robes he had worn to face his murderers. As dawn broke, word began to spread. Pilgrims who had come to Canterbury for blessings now found themselves standing before a corpse that would change Christendom forever. By noon, the bells began to toll. In every corner of England, people heard them and asked what tragedy had struck. The answer came swiftly, whispered from mouth to mouth, from market to monastery. The Archbishop is dead, murdered at the altar. The nation reeled in horror. Even those who had once opposed Becket now trembled at the thought of what had been done. To spill blood in a church, worse, to slay the head of England's church in his own cathedral, was an act of unthinkable sacrilege. In the days that followed, Canterbury became a place of pilgrimage not for prayer, but for grief. Men and women journeyed from miles away, barefoot and weeping, to see where their shepherd had fallen. The monks allowed them to touch the blood-stained floor, and many swore that miracles began to happen. A blind man claimed his sight returned after touching the dried blood. A woman said her paralyzed hand could move again. A child near death recovered after a few drops of water mixed with Becket's blood were given to him. It was said that Becket's blood did not darken with time. It gleamed red, like the living flame of defiance that no sword could kill. Meanwhile, across the sea in Normandy, King Henry II received the news. When the messenger entered his hall, the king was laughing with his knights. The laughter died the instant the man fell to his knees and cried, "My lord, the Archbishop of Canterbury is dead, slain in his own church." For a long moment, no one breathed. Then Henry's face went pale. He staggered back as if struck. What have they done?" he whispered. The words he had shouted in anger. "Will no one rid me of this turbulent priest?" Now echoed in his mind like the toll of judgment. He tore at his hair, dropped to the floor, and screamed, "They have destroyed me! They have destroyed me!" The courtiers watched as the most powerful man in Christendom collapsed like a broken soul. He refused food, refused sleep. For 3 days, he wandered his chambers, weeping, praying, cursing himself. "By my words," he murmured, "I have murdered a saint." But guilt alone could not contain the storm that followed. Across Europe, the reaction was instant and furious. The Pope, Alexander III, wept upon hearing the news. The church thundered in outrage. Bishops denounced Henry's name in sermons. Even kings of neighboring lands whispered that the English monarch had brought divine wrath upon his realm. Henry's enemies rejoiced. The French court mocked him. His nobles grew restless. And from the common people came whispers of prophecy. A king who kills a priest will find no rest upon his throne. Back in Canterbury, Becket's burial was humble, too humble for the man he had become in death. The monks buried him quietly in the crypt, fearing the king's wrath might still reach across the sea. But the people would not let the memory fade. Day after day, pilgrims came to the tomb. They left offerings, prayed, and carried away small tokens, bits of cloth dipped in his blood, fragments of stone from the altar. The stories of miracles grew in number. Sick were healed, the blind saw, the lame walked. Becket's name became a hymn on every lip. To the poor, he was their champion. To the oppressed, their protector. To the church, he was no longer Thomas the man, but Thomas the martyr. And with every tale of healing, the legend grew stronger. The church began its investigation. Rome sent envoys to gather witness accounts. The miracles were verified, one after another, and within just 2 years, Thomas Becket was officially canonized as a saint by Pope Alexander III. His shrine became one of the most sacred places in all of Europe. Kings, queens, and peasants alike made pilgrimages to Canterbury. The road itself became known as a pilgrim's way, a path of devotion that will remain for centuries. It was said that those who prayed before Becket's tomb could feel the air tremble with his presence. Candles never seemed to burn out. The scent of roses sometimes filled the crypt, even in the dead of winter. But across the channel, Henry's torment only deepened. He knew that every miracle, every prayer, every pilgrim's footstep on English soil was another stone laid on the altar of his guilt. The Pope's response was severe. Henry was threatened with excommunication. His kingdom would interdict, a punishment that would suspend all church services in England. No baptisms, no marriages, no funerals. To medieval minds, it was a death sentence for the soul. The king had no choice but to submit. He sent envoys to Rome, pleading for forgiveness. But the Pope's demand was clear: public penance. And so, in July 1174, the proud King Henry II, ruler of England, conqueror of lands, master of men, walked barefoot through the streets of Canterbury. The people watched in awe and disbelief as a king, dressed in rough sackcloth, made his way to the cathedral where Becket had died. His feet bled on the stones. His eyes were red from weeping. When he reached the crypt, he knelt before Becket's tomb. Then, one by one, 80 monks stepped forward, each carrying a whip, and before the watching crowd, the King of England was flogged in penance for his sin. Each lash fell with a crack that echoed through the cathedral. Henry did not resist. He whispered prayers through the pain. When it was done, he lay upon the cold floor, pressing his lips to the stone that still bore the faint trace of Becket's blood. He had sought to control the church. Instead, The church had conquered him. From that day, the world saw a different Henry. The rage was gone. In its place was the weight of sorrow, the kind that only kings who have killed their friends can know. The death of Thomas Becket had shaken all of Christendom. But more than that, it had changed the balance of power forever. No sword, no army, no crown could erase what had been done in Canterbury. And from that blood, a new truth had been born. Years had passed since that dreadful December night at Canterbury. The blood that once pooled beneath the altar had long dried, but its stain remained, etched not only into stone, but into the soul of England itself. Thomas Becket was no longer a man. He had become a symbol, a warning, a saint whose death had outshone a king's reign. And as time flowed on, his story spread far beyond the island that birthed it, across Europe. The name Thomas of Canterbury became a cry for defiance against tyranny, a prayer for justice when kings forgot the laws of God. The shrine built in his honor grew into one of the grandest in the Christian world. Gold and jewels adorned it, gifts from monarchs and peasants alike. Pilgrims traveled from France, Italy, even distant Scandinavia, walking for weeks just to kneel before the place where he had fallen. They brought offerings, rings, coins, silks, weapons, all laid before the saint who had stood unarmed before death. The sick came on crutches, the blind led by hand, the hopeless crawling on their knees. Many claimed healing. Many left changed forever. The monks of Canterbury kept records of the miracles. A knight cured of leprosy, a woman healed of madness, a child raised from the brink of death. Each story, true or not, strengthened the legend. Becket's tomb was no longer just a grave. It was a throne of faith, and the church, always keen to see the divine hand in history, proclaimed what many already believed. Thomas Becket had not merely died. He had been chosen. But not all saw holiness in the blood that had been spilled. Some whispered that the church had used Becket's martyrdom to chain the crown. Others said the saint's pride had brought the tragedy upon himself. Yet even those who questioned his motives could not deny one truth. The sword that struck him down had also struck fear into every ruler who thought to challenge the church. Henry II lived on, haunted but humbled. His reign continued, marked by reforms and wars. But the shadow of Canterbury never left him. Whenever he entered a church, he was said to lower his head. Whenever he heard the bells of Canterbury toll, his eyes would cloud. He died in 1189, broken and weary, betrayed by his own sons. And when he was laid to rest, many whispered that the real ghost that tormented him until his final breath was not his rebellious children, but his murdered friend. As for Becket, his name endured through generations. His feast day, December 29th, became one of the holiest dates on the Christian calendar. Churches rose in his honor, from England to Rome. His story was told in ballads and painted in glass, immortalized in every shimmering color of cathedral windows. And yet, perhaps the greatest testament to his power came not from kings or bishops, but from the people themselves. Every pilgrim who made the journey to Canterbury carried a piece of his legend home. They spoke of the place where courage met cruelty, where a man of faith had defied the sword. And so, long before the printing press, before newspapers or books, the story of Thomas Becket spread through whispers, songs, and memory, generation after generation, keeping his fire alive. 2 centuries later, another king would challenge that fire. In 1538, Henry VIII, furious at the power of Rome and determined to make himself the head of the English church, ordered the destruction of Becket's shrine. To the new Henry, Becket was no saint but a traitor, one who had dared defy royal authority. The king's men stormed Canterbury, breaking open the shrine, seizing its treasures and scattering its relics. The golden chest that held Becket's bones was smashed to pieces. The jewels that had shone in candlelight for centuries were melted down to fill royal coffers. And the bones of the martyr, those that millions had kissed and wept over, were burned and thrown into the river Stour. The king even ordered Becket's name erased from prayer books across England. "There shall be no more talk of this rebel priest," he declared. "Let him be forgotten." But saints are not so easily erased. For even as his relics burned, his memory refused to die. In France, in Italy, in every corner of Europe, pilgrims still whispered prayers to St. Thomas of Canterbury. Sailors carved his cross into ship masts. Mothers named their sons Thomas, hoping the courage of the martyr would live on in them. And though his shrine was gone, the place where he fell, the spot before the altar of Canterbury Cathedral, remained sacred ground. Visitors would come quietly, kneeling where the blood once pooled, feeling the chill of stone that still seemed to echo with his last words. For the name of Jesus and protection of the church, I am ready to die. Over time, Becket's story evolved from mere history to legend, a mirror of mankind's eternal struggle between conscience and power. Poets and playwrights retold it, each generation finding new meaning in his defiance. To some, he was a saint defending faith. To others, a rebel who challenged authority. But to all, he was proof that conviction can outlive kings. In the 14th century, Geoffrey Chaucer's Canterbury Tales would forever immortalize a pilgrimage to Becket's shrine, turning it into a symbol of spiritual journey and redemption. Even as England's faith fractured in the centuries to come, Becket's name endured, a ghost that refused to fade. And so, the story that began with friendship and ended in blood continued to echo through time. It whispered in every cathedral built upon the bones of faith. It lingered in the silence between kings and priests, each remembering what happened when a crown believed itself above God. It reminded the world that even the mightiest rulers must one day bow, not to man but to conscience. For Thomas Becket's death was not merely a tragedy, it was a turning point. It drew a line in the sand between the temporal and the divine, between the laws of men and the justice of heaven. And no matter how many centuries passed, that line remained carved deep into the soul of Europe. Today, nearly 1,000 years later, pilgrims still walk the ancient road to Canterbury. They follow the same path that once echoed with the cries of a dying priest. They kneel in the cathedral where he fell, and though the golden shrine is gone, the air still feels heavy with something unspoken, something eternal. Some say that if you listen closely in the silence of the crypt, you can hear faint whispers, a prayer, a sigh, or perhaps the echo of a voice that refused to yield, saying once more, for the name of Jesus and the protection of the church. A pause, a breath, and then, I am ready to die.